Clara Whitmore did not cry when they put her up for auction. She had stopped crying months ago, stopped speaking, stopped reaching, stopped hoping. She stood on that splintered wooden platform in the August heat of Red Hollow, Colorado, barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, and stared at the ground, while the auctioneer called out numbers that nobody answered. 8 years old, alone in a crowd of 50 people, and not one of them would look her in the eye. Then the horse came. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow along with me until the very last word. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The auctioneer's name was Harold Finch, and he had been selling things in Red Hollow for 22 years. Cattle land, furniture, horses, and on 2 prior occasions, the labor contracts of orphaned children. He told himself it was necessary work. Civilized work. The kind of thing a decent community did when it had no other choice. But standing on that platform on the morning of August the 14th, 1873, even Harold Finch could not quite bring himself to meet the child's eyes. "We have before us," he announced to the gathered crowd, mopping his forehead with a damp handkerchief, "Clara Whitmore, age 8, late of the Whitmore family out of Junction Creek. Parents deceased as of April last. Child is physically healthy, capable of basic domestic labor, and currently nonverbal." He paused there, cleared his throat. "Nonverbal meaning she don't speak. Hasn't spoken since the accident. Doctors say there ain't nothing physically wrong with her throat. It's a condition of the nerves, they say." A murmur rolled through the crowd like a cold wind. Clara heard every word. She always did. She simply stood with her chin down and her hands folded in front of her, the way she'd learned to stand when she wanted to disappear. Her hair was braided badly. One of the churchwomen had done it that morning with rough fingers and no patience. And her dress was the same gray one she'd been wearing since the wagon rolled off the cliff 3 months prior. They'd washed it twice. The bloodstain near the collar hadn't fully come out. "We'll start the bidding at $20, Finch said, "for a full indenture contract. 5 years of domestic service to whatever family sees fit to—" "She's cursed," said a woman near the front. The voice belonged to Mildred Hurst, wife of the grain merchant, who said most things in Red Hollow that other people were only willing to think. She stood with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a flat line, looking at Clara the way someone looks at a sick animal they've already decided not to save. "Woman lost her whole family in one afternoon," Mildred continued. "Parents dead, no kin come forward, and the child herself won't say a word to nobody. That ain't grief. That's a curse, plain and simple." "Now, Mildred," Finch started, "I'm just saying what everybody's thinking, Harold. That child sat in the church for 2 weeks, and not one person in this town could get a single word out of her. Preacher tried. Doctor tried. Even Sister Agnes. God bless her patience. Nothing. You bring something like that into your home, into your family, and who knows what follows her in." Clara's hands tightened against each other, just slightly, just enough that her knuckles went pale. A man in the back, a farmer named Dewey Colton who'd come into town, half convinced he might take on a farmhand, turned to his wife and said something low. His wife shook her head once. They both took a small step backward. $20? Finch said again, his voice losing its authority the way water loses heat. "Do I have $20 for the child, anyone?" Silence. Not the respectful kind, the uncomfortable kind, the kind where 50 people are all carefully studying their boots or the sky or the grain sacks stacked outside the feed store, anywhere but the platform. 15, Finch said, lowering his voice as if the number embarrassed him. $15 for a healthy child who can work and— "Nobody wants a mute," said a man near the well. No offense meant to the girl. But a child that won't speak is a child you can't manage. Can't know what she's thinking. Can't know what she's feeling. Could be anything going on in that head of hers. "She's 8 years old," said a younger woman near the back, a schoolteacher named Ruth Alcott, who had only been in Red Hollow 2 months and still had not learned that speaking up rarely changed anything. "She watched her parents die. She's frightened, not cursed." "Ruth, honey," said Mildred Hurst, not unkindly but firmly. "You are welcome to take her then." Ruth Alcott went quiet. Clara heard that too. She heard every word of it, the way you hear a conversation about your own funeral when nobody realizes you're still alive in the room. She heard the farmer step back. She heard the school teacher go silent. She heard the auctioneer's voice drop lower and lower, the way voices do when the situation becomes something a person wants to end quickly and forget about. And somewhere deep beneath the stillness, she wore like a second skin. Clara understood something with a clarity that no 8-year-old should ever have to possess. They were not going to find her a home today. They were going to find her somewhere else to put her. She had overheard Sheriff Dade talking to Finch 3 days ago through the thin wall of the church vestibule, the territorial orphanage in Creed. They sent children there when no placement could be found. The man who ran it, a warden named Fulton, was known in the county for 2 things: keeping his books clean and working his wards from sunup to sundown in the mine operations he contracted with. Children went in at 8 and came out if they came out at 16, having never seen a schoolroom or a Sunday free of labor. Sheriff Dade had said with genuine regret in his voice, "It ain't ideal, Harold, but what else can we do? Nobody's going to take a child who won't talk." And Finch had said, equally regretful, "I know it. Give me one more try at the auction. If nobody bids, I'll send the paperwork to Creed by Friday." Today was Wednesday. Clara stood on the platform and stared at the ground and thought very quietly that she should have tried harder to speak. She had wanted to. The words were there, she could feel them sitting just below her throat, like stones in still water. But every time she reached for them, the image came back. The cliff edge. The sky going sideways. Her mother's voice saying her name once very clearly, and then the silence that followed that was so total and so absolute that Clara had simply stayed inside it. It felt safer there. It felt like the only place that couldn't hurt her anymore. $10, Finch said, and now there was a kind of desperation in it. Someone give me $10 for this child. That was when the horse came. They heard it before they saw it. A heavy, unhurried rhythm of hooves on the packed dirt road coming from the north. The mountain road, the one that wound up into the Rockies and didn't lead anywhere most people had cause to go. The crowd shifted. People turned. The man who rode into Red Hollow on that August morning was not the kind of man you described quickly or forgot easily. He sat his horse the way certain men do, not showing off, not performing ease, but simply occupying the saddle the way a mountain occupies a valley, like it was built for exactly that purpose. He was enormous, not in the fat way, but in the way of men who have spent years doing brutal physical work in brutal conditions. His coat was elk-hide. His hat was sweat-stained and shapeless. His face was a geography of old damage, a scar that ran jaw to cheekbone on the left side, a nose broken more than once, eyes the color of winter clouds that hadn't decided yet whether to snow. People recognized him. The recognition moved through the crowd the way a cold hand moves down a spine, starting at the neck and going slowly downward. "Lord Almighty," whispered Dewey Colton, "that's Silas Boone." His wife grabbed his arm. Silas Boone, the mountain trapper. The man who'd come back from the war and gone straight up into the Rockies and hadn't come down more than 4 times in 6 years. People told stories about him, some true, some not, most somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. That he'd killed 9 men at Cold Harbor with his bare hands when his rifle ran dry. That he'd driven off a band of raiders by himself, with nothing but a hunting knife and bad intentions. That he'd once walked 30 miles in a blizzard with a broken collarbone, because his pack mule had gone lame, and he wasn't the type to leave supplies behind. The stories agreed on one thing. Silas Boone was not a man you wanted angry at you. He rode to the edge of the crowd and stopped his horse and looked at the platform. His eyes moved over the auctioneer, over the gathered townspeople, and then they settled on Clara. He looked at her for a long moment. Clara, who had stopped expecting anything from anyone, did not look up. "What's the situation?" Silas said. His voice was low and unhurried and carried the kind of weight that didn't need volume. Finch swallowed. "Ah, Mr. Boone, we're conducting a placement auction for an orphaned child. The girl's parents died in April. No families come forward. We're looking for a family willing to take her on as a ward or an indenture. What's her name? Clara. Clara Whitmore. Silas looked at Clara again. How long's she been standing up there? About 40 minutes, sir. In this heat? It wasn't a question. Finch mopped his forehead again. Yes, sir. And nobody's bid. Another silence from the crowd, the uncomfortable kind. Silas dismounted slowly. He was even larger on foot than on horseback, which was always a startling thing to witness. He handed his reins to the nearest bystander, a boy of about 12, who accepted them with wide eyes and no protest, and walked toward the platform. The crowd parted for him. People didn't do it consciously exactly. They just found themselves stepping sideways, creating a corridor of empty space that Silas Boone walked through without acknowledging it. He stopped at the base of the platform steps. He looked up at Clara. That child doesn't have shoes on, he said mostly to himself in a tone that was not loud but contained something iron in it. Mildred Hurst said with great dignity, "The church provided what it could, Mr. Boone. Resources are—" "I ain't talking to you, ma'am." Mildred closed her mouth. Silas reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch, the kind used for gold dust, and he turned and looked at Harold Finch. "What's the highest bid so far?" Finch cleared his throat. There haven't been any bids, Mr. Boone." Silas nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. He stepped up onto the platform. He set the leather pouch down on the auctioneer's stand with a sound that was heavy and definitive. $500, he said. Gold weight. Take it or send a man to fetch it from the assay office in Creed. Your choice. The crowd erupted. Not loudly, and Red Hollow people expressed shock in murmurs and sharp intakes of breath rather than outright noise, but the eruption was real. $500 was not an amount that people spent on orphan placement. It was an amount that bought land. It was the kind of number that made people question the sanity of the man naming it. Finch stared at the pouch, stared at Silas. "Mr. Boone, I'm obliged to ask your intentions, sir. For the record." Silas looked at him steadily. "My intention is to give this child a roof and a fire and enough to eat. That satisfy your record?" "You ain't married, Mr. Boone. You live alone up in—" "I'm aware of my living arrangements." "A child needs a woman's influence, people would say." "People," said Silas Boone, with a quietness that was somehow more pointed than shouting. "Left this child standing barefoot on a platform for 40 minutes in August and didn't bid $10 for her. I ain't taking instruction today from people." Silence. Then Silas did something that nobody in Red Hollow had expected, and that most of them would talk about for the rest of their lives. He turned away from Finch. He turned away from the crowd. And he lowered himself, this enormous, war-scarred, terrifying man, down onto one knee on the rough platform boards until he was eye level with Clara Whitmore. He didn't touch her. He didn't reach for her. He just looked at her. The way you look at something that has been treated carelessly by people who should have known better. Clara finally lifted her eyes. She looked at his face, the scar, the broken nose, the winter cloud eyes, and she did not flinch. Maybe because she had learned that the things that looked frightening weren't always the things that hurt you. Or maybe because something in those gray eyes was unexpectedly the quietest thing she had seen since April. "My name's Silas," he said. "Just that. Low and even, and without any performance in it. I got a cabin up in the mountains. It ain't fancy. It's got a fire that stays warm and a door that locks, and nobody up there who's going to bother you." He paused. "I ain't buying a servant, little one. I'm offering you a home." Clara stared at him. She did not speak. But something shifted in her face, not a smile, not quite, but a slight easing of the tightness around her eyes. Like a fist slowly opening, she gave the smallest nod. Silas rose to his feet. He looked at Finch. "We done here." Finch, for once in his life, did not have anything to say. He simply nodded and reached for the leather pouch. Silas stepped down from the platform. He did not carry Clara. He did not presume to touch her without permission. He simply walked to his horse and stood beside it and waited. And after a moment, Clara climbed down from the platform. Herself, stepped off the last step onto the dirt street, and walked to where he stood. The town watched. Nobody said a word, not while Silas lifted her carefully onto the horse's back, not while he mounted behind her, not while he turned the animal north toward the mountain road. Mildred Hurst pressed her lips together. Ruth Alcott, the schoolteacher, stood with her hands clasped and her eyes glistening in a way she would deny later if anyone asked. Sheriff Dade watched from the doorway of his office with an expression that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite guilt, but was somewhere in between, and then they were gone. The horse's hooves faded up the mountain road. The crowd stood in the street for another moment, then began to disperse in ones and twos, and the conversation started low and urgent, and with that particular flavor of unease that settles over a community when it has collectively done something it cannot entirely defend. "He paid $500, Dewey Colton said to his wife as they walked back toward their wagon. "I heard," she said. "No man pays $500 for an orphan child without some kind of reason." His wife said nothing. "That child needs someone to go up there and check on her," said Mildred Hurst to anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, that man is not right. Living alone in those mountains all these years. A child in the care of a man like that." "Nobody else bid," said Ruth Alcott clearly from 3 feet away. Mildred looked at her. "Nobody else bid," Ruth said again. "Not $20, not 10, not 5. We were about to send that little girl to the Creed orphanage and let Fulton work her in the mine shafts until she was 16. She picked up her school satchel from the step where she'd set it. "So I'm not sure we've got a great deal of standing today to talk about what that child needs." She walked away. "Famid Sunso." Mildred opened her mouth, closed it, turned to the woman beside her who was suddenly very interested in something across the street. Up on the mountain road beyond the tree line, beyond the first ridge, the horse moved at a steady walk through the afternoon heat. Clara sat in front of Silas on the saddle very still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the trees go by. She had not been on a horse since before the accident. She had forgotten that they smelled like warm hay and honest effort. After a while, Silas spoke. "You hungry?" Clara did not answer, but she looked down slightly, which might have meant yes. "I got dried elk and biscuits in the saddlebag," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it'll hold you till we get up to the cabin." He reached without looking and produced a biscuit wrapped in cloth and held it out to the side within her reach without making a show of it. Clara looked at the biscuit. She took it. She ate it carefully in small bites, like someone who had learned not to trust that food would keep coming. Silas watched the road ahead and said nothing about it. The mountains rose around them as the afternoon wore on, pines thickening the air. Cooling by degrees, the noise of the town falling away like something shed. Clara had never been this high before. The world looked different up here, bigger, less crowded with people and their opinions. The sky was a color of blue that didn't seem to belong to the same August she'd spent sweating in the church vestibule. "You don't have to talk," Silas said after a long while. "Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever if it comes to that." He said it without looking at her the same way he'd offered the biscuit without making her feel watched. "I ain't much for talking myself. We'll get on fine." Clara turned this over. She looked up at the side of his face, at the scar running jaw to cheekbone. She wondered where it came from, the same way she wondered about most things in the private quiet of her own mind, where words still moved freely, even if they never found their way out. She looked forward again, at the road ahead, at the trees, at the mountain going up and up until it disappeared into the afternoon sky. And for the first time since April, since the world went sideways and the silence swallowed her whole, Clara Whitmore did not feel like she was being carried towards something terrible. She didn't feel safe. Not yet. She had learned what happened to safe feelings when you let yourself believe in them. But she felt something. Something small and unfamiliar, and careful, like the first green thing pushing through ground that had been frozen a long time. The horse climbed. The town fell away below them, and the mountain closed around them both like a hand that meant for once no harm. Back in Red Hollow, the conversation was already changing shape. By sundown, it would not be about what the town had failed to do. It would be about what the mountain man might do. By the following week, the rumors would have grown teeth. And by the time the first snow fell on the Rockies, those teeth would find their way to the ears of men with authority and ambition and no particular interest in the truth. But that was later. For now, there was only the road and the mountain and a man who did not speak unless he had something to say, and a child who had forgotten that silence could be a kind of company instead of a kind of punishment. Silas Boone had lived alone in those mountains for 6 years. He had told himself in the way men tell themselves things they need to believe that he preferred it that way. That the war had taken from him everything soft and left behind only the hard parts. And the hard parts were better suited to altitude and weather and the clean honesty of wilderness than they were to towns and people and all the complicated damage human beings do to each other without meaning to. He had a wife once, Eleanor. Dark hair, quick laugh, the kind of woman who could make a room feel warmer simply by walking into it. He had a daughter once, Lily, 4 years old when he left for the war. 4 years and 3 months when the fever came while he was at Cold Harbor, learning the particular education that battlefields specialize in. By the time the letter reached him, weeks late, carried by a courier who'd lost 3 other letters in a river crossing, both of them were already buried in the churchyard outside Hatcher's Creek, Missouri. Eleanor in the good dress she'd been saving for her sister's wedding. Lily in the yellow dress, the one with the embroidered hem that Eleanor had made by lamplight over the course of one whole winter. He hadn't gone back to Hatcher's Creek after the war. He couldn't account for why exactly, except that the man who'd left that town was not the man who'd come back, and the man who'd come back had no use for the life the first man had been building. He'd gone up instead, literally and otherwise. Into the Rockies, into the cold, and the altitude, and the work of survival, which was at least an honest kind of suffering, the kind that came from the outside and required a practical response, rather than the other kind, which came from the inside and had no practical response at all. 6 years. He'd been doing fine. He told himself that every morning. He was still telling himself that when he'd ridden into Red Hollow for supplies 3 days ago and heard half accidentally through the open door of the general store about the Orphan auction scheduled for Wednesday. About the little girl. About the rumor going around that nobody was going to bid. He'd bought his supplies. He'd loaded his pack horse. He'd ridden 3 miles back up the mountain road. He'd turned around. He told himself he didn't know why. He was fairly sure he was lying to himself. Now he rode through the early evening light with that same small, solemn child sitting in front of him, eating the last of the biscuit he'd given her, watching the mountains with eyes that were far too old for her face. And Silas Boone understood with the certainty of a man who has learned to trust his gut because it's kept him alive through worse situations than this, that whatever came next was going to require more of him than he'd planned to give anyone again. He didn't know if he had it in him. He guessed he was about to find out. The cabin appeared through the trees as the sun dropped toward the western peaks, a solid hand-built structure of pine logs and river stone, small but well made, with smoke beginning to curl from the chimney, because he'd banked the fire before he left that morning. Without quite thinking about it 3 days ago, he'd put clean bedding on the cot in the back room. He hadn't examined that impulse closely at the time. He was examining it now. Clara looked at the cabin. Then she looked up at him with a question in her face that didn't need words. "It's nothing much," he said. "But it's solid. Keeps the cold out, keeps the rain out. It's yours as long as you want it." He dismounted, then held out his hand to help her down. She looked at the hand for a moment, weighing it, measuring it, then took it and climbed down. She stood in front of the cabin. She looked at the door. She looked back at him. "Go on," he said quietly. "Door ain't locked." Clara turned back to the cabin. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the latch, a good iron latch well made, and she lifted it, and the door swung inward. The warmth reached her first. Then the smell of wood smoke and pine, and something cooking slow on the back of the stove. Then the sight of the room itself, rough-hewn, but clean. A table, 2 chairs, shelves of books along one wall, a fireplace with good stone and a hearthrug, and through the inner doorway, just visible the cot in the back room with its clean blankets folded at the foot. Clara stood in the doorway. She stood there for a long moment. Behind her, Silas waited. She stepped inside. The first morning, Clara woke before dawn and didn't know where she was. She sat up fast on the cot, heart-hammering hands gripping the edge of the blanket, and then the smell of wood smoke reached her and the sound of something heavy moving around in the other room, and she remembered. The platform, the crowd, the man with the winter cloud eyes who hadn't touched her without asking first. She sat there in the dark for a long moment listening. Boots on the plank floor, the iron scrape of the stove door, the low, particular sound of a fire being coaxed from embers back into something living. Then silence. Then the smell of coffee. Clara got up. She pushed open the door between the rooms and stood in the frame. Silas was at the stove with his back to her. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders shifted slightly. He'd heard her. "Coffee's not ready yet," he said. 10 minutes. There's water on the table if you're thirsty." She crossed to the table. There was a tin cup already set out. She poured the water and drank it and sat down and watched him work. He moved the way he did everything, without waste, without performance, like a man who had long ago stopped caring whether anyone was watching. After a while, he brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from her. He put his hands around his cup and looked out the window at the dark turning gray at the edges and didn't say anything. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup the same way. They sat like that until the sky went pink. It was the most peaceful thing that had happened to her since April. She didn't trust it. Not yet. But she filed it away in the part of her mind that still believed against all available evidence that some things in the world were what they appeared to be. That was day 1. By day 3, she had learned the layout of the cabin well enough to move through it without bumping into anything. By day 5, she knew which floorboard near the door creaked if you stepped on the left side and how to avoid it. By the end of the first week, she had discovered the shelf of books and stood in front of it for 20 minutes, running her fingers along the spines while Silas sat at the table sharpening a knife and said nothing. "Just let her look. You can read any of them," he said without looking up. "Take them apart if you want. I ain't precious about books." She pulled one out. A field guide to Rocky Mountain birds, dense with illustrations. She carried it to the hearthrug and sat down and opened it. Silas watched her for exactly 2 seconds, the way you confirm a thing you'd suspected. Then he went back to his knife. On the 9th day, something happened that Clara had not anticipated. She was outside in the yard. Silas had not told her to stay inside, and she'd tested the boundary carefully, the way you test ice by pressing one foot and waiting when the sound came. A high, thin crying from the tree line, too small for a coyote, too irregular for a bird. She stood very still and listened. It came again. She walked toward it. Silas appeared from around the side of the cabin so quickly that she stopped. "Don't go into the tree line alone," he said, not sharply but firmly, the way he said most things. "Not yet. You don't know what's out there." She looked at the trees, then back at him. "Something's hurt," she said. The words came out before she understood they were coming. Small and rough from disuse, like a door opened for the first time in months on stiff hinges. Silas went completely still. He looked at her, not with the wild expression she might have expected, not with the grabbing urgency of an adult who needs a child to perform again immediately. Just a careful, steady attention, the way you look at a flame you don't want to frighten out. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Something's hurt." He moved past her toward the tree line. "Come on then, stay behind me." They found the fox kit 20 yards and young, maybe 6 weeks, one back leg, tangled in an old piece of rusted fence wire that must have been out here since before Silas had come up the mountain. It was screaming in the thin, terrible way that small things scream when they've exhausted themselves fighting something they can't beat. Silas crouched down. "Hold still, little one," he said in the same voice he'd used on the auction platform. Clara noticed that. He spoke to frightened things the same way, regardless of what they were. He worked the wire loose with the kind of patient, precise care that his big hands shouldn't have been capable of and weren't given nearly enough credit for. The kit fought him the whole time, biting twice, drawing blood across his knuckles. He didn't flinch, didn't tighten his grip, just kept working steadily until the wire came free and the kit scrambled backward and sat trembling in the leaves, sides heaving. "Is it going to be okay?" Clara asked. Silas examined the leg from a short distance. "Probably. Doesn't look broke. It'll be sore." He stood up. "It's going to run off now. Don't try to hold on to it." The kit looked at them both for one suspended moment, that bright, wild look of a creature that doesn't know yet whether it survived, and then it bolted into the undergrowth and was gone. Clara watched the place where it had disappeared. "You talked," Silas said. "I know. Good." He pulled a cloth from his coat pocket and wrapped his bleeding knuckles without particular drama. "You want to tell me more about what else has been going on in your head all this time, or you still need a while?" Clara thought about it seriously, the way she thought about most things. "I still need a while," she said. "Fair enough," said Silas. And they walked back to the cabin. She spoke more after that. Not constantly. Not the way some children talked, filling every silence like it was a hole that needed patching. She spoke when she had something to say, and she said it plainly, and Silas responded the same way, and between words they maintained a silence that had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like understanding. He began teaching her things. Not because he'd sat down and decided to. It happened the way most things happened between them, sideways and without announcement. He was chopping wood one morning, and she was watching from the step, and he said without looking up, "You going to watch all morning, or you want to try it?" She tried it. She was terrible. He corrected her grip twice, and her stance once, and didn't make a production of either. By noon, she'd split 6 pieces that weren't pretty, but were serviceable, and something in her face when she looked at the pile was the first thing he'd seen from her that came close to pride. He taught her to read a storm from the color of the clouds and the behavior of the birds. He taught her which plants near the creek were edible and which would make her sick. He showed her how to check the snares he set along the North Trail and how to reset them, and she was better at it than he'd expected, her small hands quicker and more nimble than his for the fine work. "You've got good hands," he said one afternoon watching her reset a snare. "My mother used to say that," Clara said. She didn't look up, and her voice didn't change, but her hands stilled for just a moment before continuing. "She said I had my father's hands. He was a carpenter." Silas waited. "They weren't fighting when it happened," Clara said. "In case you wondered, a lot of people think parents fight, and that's how accidents happen. They were laughing. My mother said something funny, and my father turned to look at her, and the wheel went off the edge." She sat back on her heels. "I don't remember the noise. I remember the laughing. And then I remember waking up in the mud at the bottom of the cliff, and they were both—" She stopped. Silas sat down on the ground beside the trail, which was not a comfortable thing for a man his size to do on rough terrain, but he did it without comment. "My wife's name was Eleanor," he said. Clara looked at him. "My daughter's name was Lily. She was 4. He looked at the tree line. "Fever took them both while I was at Cold Harbor. I didn't find out for 3 weeks because the courier lost the letter in a river." Silence. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Yeah." He looked at his hands. "Me too." They sat on the ground in the trail for a while after that. Not saying anything, just sitting with the weight of it, 2 people who had both had the world rearranged without their permission, who had both learned that grief doesn't announce itself politely, but arrives all at once and takes everything it wants. Then Silas got up and offered his hand, and Clara took it, and stood, and they walked back to the cabin, side by side, and neither of them spoke about it again that day. But something had shifted. Something structural, the way a house settles after the foundation cures, and becomes more solid for having settled. Clara started sleeping through the night. It happened so gradually, she almost didn't notice. One morning she woke and looked at the window and saw full daylight, and understood with a small shock that she had not woken once in the night, screaming. She lay still and took inventory of herself, the way she'd gotten into the habit of checking each part for damage, the way you check a fence line after a storm, and discovered that everything was against all prior evidence intact. She got up and went to the other room, and Silas was at the table with his coffee and his morning silence. And she poured herself a cup and sat across from him, and he looked at her once, that brief, careful look, and then looked back out the window. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," said Clara. And that was all. And it was enough. She was sitting on the step one afternoon in early October, working on a piece of pine she'd found near the woodpile, trying to carve the shape she could see in it, a running fox. Not precisely more the idea of a running fox when she heard the horse on the lower trail. She didn't think much of it at first. Silas came and went. But then she heard a second horse, then a third. She set down the carving and stood up. Silas came around from the back of the cabin, wiping his hands on a cloth. His face already different, not alarmed exactly, but watchful in a way she'd come to recognize. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, just enough pressure to mean stay here, and moved toward the trailhead. 3 riders came up through the tree line. 2 men she didn't know in good coats that meant either money or authority, or both. The third man she recognized, Sheriff Dade from Red Hollow, looking like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. "Silas," the sheriff said by way of greeting. "Dale," said Silas. "These are Mr. Greer and Mr. Albright from the Territorial County Board. They've come up about the girl." Silas didn't move. "What about her?" The man named Greer, heavy expensive with the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no in a room that mattered, leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Mr. Boone, we've received a number of complaints from citizens of Red Hollow regarding the welfare of the Whitmore child. Concerns about the appropriateness of her placement. The county board has a responsibility." "She's fed, she's warm, she's safe," Silas said. "We done—" "Mr. Boone." Greer's voice took on an edge. "A single man living alone with no wife, no established household. This is not a suitable environment for a young girl. Regardless of the financial transaction that took place, the county board has the authority to review any placement, and—" "Who complained?" Silas said. Greer paused. "That's not relevant." "It is to me." Several citizens of the community expressed. "Mildred Hurst," Silas said flatly. "And whoever she talked into signing paper with her." The sheriff looked at his saddle horn. "Mr. Boone." Albright said. He was younger than Greer, quieter, and seemed vaguely uncomfortable with the whole enterprise. "We simply need to conduct a welfare check. If everything is as you say, there won't be any issue. We'd just like to see the child, speak with her if possible." "She don't speak to strangers," Silas said. "We'd like to try." The 2 men looked at each other over that. And then Clara, who had not stayed on the step the way Silas had indicated, stepped around from the corner of the cabin and stood in the yard. All 3 riders looked at her. She was wearing a wool coat that Silas had bought on his last trip to Town Brown, a little too large, the sleeves rolled up. Her hair was clean and braided properly, the way she'd figured out for herself after a few attempts. She was holding the half-finished fox carving in one hand. She looked at the men on the horses without flinching. Greer recovered first. He put on a voice that he probably thought sounded warm. "Hello there, Clara. My name is Mr. Greer. I work for the county. We just want to make sure you're all right." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm all right." Whatever Greer had been expecting, it wasn't that. He blinked, looked at Silas, looked back at Clara. You're speaking. Your file said you were—" "I wasn't," Clara said. "Now I am." Another silence. The wind moved through the pines. "Are you being treated well?" Greer said. "Do you have enough to eat? Are you being as Mr. Boone treating you appropriately?" Clara tilted her head slightly. "He taught me to split wood," she said, "and to read storms, and what to do if I meet a bear on the trail, which is don't run in case you didn't know." She looked at the man steadily. "He gave me books and warm food and a room with a door that locks from the inside. And he never once told me I was cursed." She paused. "You want to tell me what your concern is specifically, Mr. Greer, because I am having trouble finding it." The sheriff made a sound that was almost certainly a swallowed laugh badly disguised as a cough. Greer straightened on his saddle. His face had gone a particular color that expensive men's faces go when they've been out-argued by someone they didn't expect to put up an argument. This isn't ultimately yours to make, child. The county board. She answered your questions, Silas said. She's healthy. She's speaking. She's cared for. You can write that in your report. Mr. Boone, this is not over. There are people in Red Hollow with significant concerns, and the board will— Tell me who's driving this, Silas said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the particular way that made people stop and pay attention. Because I know it ain't you. You rode 3 hours up a mountain in October for Mildred Hurst's gossip. Someone told you to come up here. Someone with enough pull to get the county board interested in one orphan child on a mountain. I want to know who. Greer said nothing, but his eyes moved just barely, just for a fraction of a second to Albright, and Albright looked away, and Silas Boone filed that information away in the part of his mind where he kept things that mattered, the part he'd been building since the war, the part that told him when trouble was not passing through, but settling in. You're welcome to come back in spring, Silas said pleasantly. Child'll be here. I'll be here. Bring your paperwork if you want. Right now we've got supper to get to. The three riders looked at each other. Greer pulled his horse around. This isn't finished, Mr. Boone. Most things worth anything aren't, Silas said. He waited until the hoofbeats had faded back down the mountain trail. Then he looked at Clara. She was still holding the fox carving. She was looking at the trail where the riders had gone, and her face was very still, in the way that meant she was thinking hard about something. They're going to come back, she said. Probably. With more people? Likely. Clara looked at him. Why? She said. Why does it matter to them they didn't want me before? Silas picked up a piece of firewood from the stack by the door and turned it in his hands. Because them not wanting you was their choice, he said. And me wanting you, that makes it theirs to fight. He moved toward the cabin door. Come on in. It's getting cold. Clara looked down at the half-finished fox in her hands. The shape was getting clearer. Another day or two, and you'd be able to see exactly what it was. She followed him inside. She didn't know yet about the businessman in Red Hollow who had been watching the mountain with a different kind of interest than Mildred Hurst's righteous concern. She didn't know his name was Harlan Pruitt, or that he sat on 3 county boards and contributed generously to the Territorial Church Fund and smiled at everyone he wanted something from. She didn't know that when he smiled, he was usually already several steps ahead of the person he was smiling at. She didn't know that Harlan Pruitt had decided for reasons of his own that Silas Boone needed to be removed from that mountain, and he was very, very good at getting what he decided he wanted. The fire crackled. The supper pot steamed. Outside, the first cold wind of the season came off the high peaks and moved through the pines with a sound like a warning being delivered quietly to anyone smart enough to listen. Harlan Pruitt had not built his fortune by being obvious about anything. He owned the lumber contract for 3 counties. He financed the new church building in Red Hollow and put his name on the cornerstone. He lent money to struggling families at rates that seemed reasonable until they weren't, and by the time they weren't, the paperwork was already filed and the land was already his. He did all of it with a wide smile and a firm handshake, and the particular warmth of a man who understood that people trust what they like, and people like what flatters them. He was not interested in Clara Whitmore for any reason anyone in Red Hollow would have guessed. He was interested in the mountain. Silas Boone's mountain, the upper parcel, the ridge above the tree line, where a man named Caleb Pruitt Harlan's younger brother and geological surveyor had spent 2 weeks the prior summer before Silas ran him off with a rifle and a single sentence that Caleb had reported word for word, "Get off my land or don't get off it. Your choice." Caleb had gotten off it, but not before he'd found what he'd come to find. Silver. Not a trace vein. A serious deposit, the kind that changed fortunes and built towns and turned ordinary men into the kind of men who had buildings named after them. Silas Boone didn't know about the silver. Or if he did, he'd never said so to anyone. He just lived on the mountain, and kept people off it, and had absolutely no intention of selling, which Harlan Pruitt had established through 3 separate intermediaries over the past 2 years. A man who would not sell could not be bought. But a man who was legally removed from his property by territorial authority, that was a different situation entirely. Property without a lawful occupant reverted to territorial claim, and territorial claim went to auction, and Harlan Pruitt knew exactly who would win that auction. He just needed to remove Silas Boone first. The orphan child had been, from Harlan's perspective, an unexpected gift. A dangerous mountain man taking an 8-year-old girl from a public auction, without a wife, without a household, without any of the apparatus that society associated with respectable child-rearing. That was a story Harlan could work with. He had friends on the territorial board. He had a cousin who edited the county newspaper. And he had Mildred Hurst, who required no payment at all and needed only the smallest suggestion to do exactly what Harlan needed done. By November, the story in Red Hollow had grown into something unrecognizable. Not through any single lie, but through the accumulation of small distortions, the way a photograph goes wrong, not from one error, but from a dozen tiny ones that add up to something that looks nothing like the original subject. That child is suffering up there, Mildred told anyone who would listen, which was most people. Mark my words, a man that lives like an animal in the wilderness, what kind of life is that for a little girl? By December 3, formal complaints had been filed with the territorial board. By January, a different set of officials rode up the mountain. These ones had a document. Silas heard them coming from farther off than they expected. He'd been in the Rockies long enough that his ears had recalibrated to silence, and anything that broke that silence registered before most men would have lifted their heads. He was at the table, working on a piece of harness leather, when he heard 3 horses on the lower trail, and he set down the leather and picked up nothing, which Clara had learned meant he was thinking carefully. "Someone's coming," she said from the hearthrug, not looking up from the book she was reading. She'd worked through most of the shelf by now, and had moved on to a thick volume on territorial land law that she'd pulled out without explanation 3 weeks prior, and had been reading with focused attention ever since. 3 horses, Silas said. Official. Probably. Clara closed the book and stood up. "Stay inside," Silas said. "No," said Clara. He looked at her. She looked back. They'd had versions of this exchange before, and Silas had learned that when Clara said no in that particular quiet tone, the conversation was over. "Fine," he said. "But let me do the talking." "That depends on what they say," said Clara. The men who came up the trail this time were not Greer and Albright. There were 4 of them, 2 county men, 1 territorial marshal in an official coat, and a 4th man. Silas didn't recognize who had the look of a lawyer too clean for outdoor work papers in a leather satchel. Eyes that moved over everything and assigned values. The marshal's name was Connolly. He had the decency to look Silas in the eye when he spoke, which Silas filed as a point in his favor, even under the circumstances. "Mr. Boone," Connolly said, "I have here a territorial order for the removal of the minor child Clara Whitmore from this residence, pending a formal custody review by the territorial board in Denver." He held out the document. "It's signed by Judge Harker." Silas did not take the document. "On what grounds?" "Concerns regarding the suitability of—" "On what specific grounds, Marshal? I want the language." Connolly looked at the paper. "Unstable living conditions. Lack of appropriate female supervision. Documented history of violent behavior by the occupant." "What documented history?" "Your service record has been reviewed, Mr. Boone. The events at Cold Harbor are a matter of military record. There's also an affidavit from a Mr. Harlan Pruitt of Red Hollow regarding an incident involving your rifle and a surveyor." "I pointed a rifle at a man who was trespassing on my land," Silas said. "He left. Nobody was hurt. That's not a history of violence, that's property law." The lawyer spoke up from behind Connolly with the kind of smooth professional voice that made Silas want to hit something. "Mr. Boone, the board isn't here to adjudicate those specifics today. The order simply requires that the child be placed in temporary care while the formal review proceeds. It's a legal process. It will be fair." Who filed the complaint? That information. Was it Harlan Pruitt? Another exchanged look. Silas caught it. You're telling me, Silas said, and his voice was dropping in pitch, the way Clara had learned to pay close attention to, that a man who wants my land filed a complaint with the territorial board about a child he's never met, and the board sent 4 men up a mountain in January to take her, and you want me to call that a fair process. Mr. Boone, I want his name on the record, Marshal. I want it stated that Harlan Pruitt of Red Hollow filed this complaint. I want that in your paperwork. Connolly hesitated. Then he nodded once. I'll note it. The lawyer stepped forward. Mr. Boone, the order is lawful and it will be executed today. The only question is whether this happens calmly or whether it doesn't. A man with your history of— Say history of violence one more time, Silas said. The lawyer stopped talking. The air on that mountain had a particular quality in January, thin and cold and very still. The kind of still that makes sound carry farther than it should. Clara, standing 6 feet behind Silas in the cabin doorway, could hear everyone breathing. She could hear Silas breathing. She knew that sound. She'd learned it over 5 months of living in close quarters with a man who kept enormous amounts of feeling behind a face designed not to show it. She knew the difference between his ordinary silence and the silence that preceded something irreversible. He was about to do something that would destroy everything. Not because he was violent, she knew better than anyone that he wasn't, that the violence in him was the controlled kind that only moved when it had no other option. But because he was furious in the deep structural way that men are furious when everything they've built is being systematically dismantled by people who have no right to touch it, and that fury was about to come out of him in a way that would give these men exactly what they needed to justify everything they'd come here to do. Clara stepped forward. She moved past Silas, which required him to either grab her or step aside. He stepped aside barely instinctively, and she walked out into the cold yard and stood between him and the 4 men on horses, and she said, I'd like to speak. Every man on every horse went completely still. It was the lawyer who recovered first. You must be Clara. We've been— I know who you are, Clara said. Her voice was steady and clear, and had none of the roughness in it that she'd had when she first started speaking again. 5 months of conversation with Silas had done its work. You're the men they sent to take me away. I want to tell you something before you do. Connolly leaned forward slightly. Go ahead, child. My name is Clara Whitmore, she said. I am 8 years old. In April of this year, both my parents died in front of me, and I was brought to Red Hollow and put in a church vestibule for 2 weeks while people decided what to do with me. The doctor came twice. The preacher came 4 times. Not one person in that town came to sit with me. Not one person brought me anything to read or anything to do or anything that was not strictly necessary to keep me breathing. She looked at each man in turn. In August, they put me on a platform in the street and tried to auction my labor for $20, and nobody bid. Not 20, not 10, not 5. She paused. The man they are now calling unstable paid $500 and brought me up this mountain and gave me a room and a fire and books and a reason to start speaking again. He has never once raised his voice at me. He has never once frightened me. He has never once treated me like I was a burden or a problem or a thing to be managed. Her voice didn't shake. It was one of the most remarkable things the marshal had ever witnessed, and he had witnessed a considerable number of remarkable things in his career. The people asking you to take me away left me to rot in a church vestibule. I want to know why their concern for me starts now and didn't exist in April. The yard was completely silent. The lawyer had his mouth open, but no sound was coming out of it. Connolly sat very still on his horse and looked at this small girl in an oversized wool coat standing in a January mountain yard, and felt something he had not expected to feel on this assignment, which was doubt. Behind Clara, Silas had gone completely still. The fury hadn't disappeared. She could feel it there, banked down, held in, but it wasn't moving anymore. Clara, Connolly said carefully, I understand what you're saying, And I hear you, but the order? Who is Harlan Pruitt? Clara said. Connolly blinked. He's a businessman in Red Hollow who... Has he ever met me? Pause. Has he ever met Silas? She pressed. I can't speak to... He wants the mountain, Clara said. Doesn't he? Or something on it. That's why he filed the complaint. Not because he cares about me. She looked at the marshal steadily. You know that's true. I can see it in your face. Connolly said nothing. The lawyer found his voice. None of that is relevant to the lawful execution of this order, young lady. The complaint was filed through proper channels. The board reviewed it and... Then I want to go to Denver, Clara said. Everyone stared at her. If there's a review board, she said, I want to stand in front of it. I want to tell them exactly what I just told you. I want them to ask me their questions, and I will answer every one. She turned and looked at Silas. We'll go together, to the hearing, and we'll let the board decide. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite the look she'd seen before. It was new, and it was the kind of thing that if you caught it and looked at it directly, would probably embarrass both of you. He turned back to Connolly. You want to take her to a hearing, or you want to take her to temporary placement, he said. Those are two different things. I want to know which one's on that paper. Connolly read the document. He read it twice with the careful attention of a man who has just realized that a thing he thought was simple is not simple. The order says temporary placement pending review, he said slowly. But the review is mandatory. She has the right to attend. Then she attends, Silas said. With me. The temporary placement. If you take her off this mountain without me, Silas said, I will be in Denver before that hearing starts, and I will say publicly and on the record that Harlan Pruitt sent 4 men up a mountain in January to remove a child from the only stable home she's had since her parents died because he wants the mineral rights to my land. You can be there or not. He looked at the lawyer. How does that sound to your board? The lawyer looked at Connolly. Connolly looked at the document. And then, in the way that moments sometimes turn, not with a dramatic blow, but with a very quiet decision, the marshal folded the paper and put it in his coat. We ride to Denver in 3 days, Connolly said. Mr. Boone, you'll bring the child to Red Hollow by Friday morning, and we'll travel together to the territorial courthouse. The hearing is set for the following Tuesday. He held Silas's gaze. Don't make me regret this. I never make a man regret being reasonable, Silas said. The 4 riders turned and started down the mountain trail. The lawyer was saying something to Connolly in a low, urgent voice, and Connolly was not responding to it, which Clara noted as a second point in the marshal's favor. When the sound of the horses had faded completely, Clara turned around. Silas was looking at her with that expression again, the new one. How did you know about Pruitt? He said. I read the land law book, Clara said. And I listened when you talked to Connolly. His eyes went wrong when you said Pruitt's name. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. You knew already, didn't you? About the mineral rights. I suspected. Why didn't you tell me? You were 8 years old. I'm still 8 years old. Yeah, said Silas. I'm starting to revise what that means. He turned toward the cabin door. Come on, we need to talk about Denver. They went inside. Clara sat at the table and Silas put the coffee on, and they talked for 3 hours about what was coming the board. The questions, the men who would be deciding her future from behind a bench in a Denver courthouse. Silas told her what he knew about territorial hearings, which was enough to be useful. Clara told him what she'd read in the land law book, which was more than he'd expected. They talked through it the way they talked through everything plainly, without pretending the situation was better or worse than it was. It was late when Clara finally said, Are you scared? Silas was quiet for a moment. I'm something, he said. I'm not sure scared is the right word. What's the right word? He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. Determined, he said at last. I'm determined. Clara nodded. She picked up the half-finished fox carving from the shelf where she kept it and turned it in her hands. The shape was fully visible. Now the fox, mid-stride, 1 foot, lifted ears forward, caught in the moment just after it decided to run. She'd been working on the fine details, the texture of the fur, the particular set of the jaw. "I'm going to finish this before we leave," she said. "Okay," said Silas. "And I'm going to take it with me to Denver." "Why?" Clara looked at the carving. "Because the last time I was somewhere, people were deciding my future. I didn't have anything in my hands. I didn't have anything at all." She set it down carefully. "I'm not going back to that." Silas looked at her across the table, at this 8-year-old girl who had walked through the worst thing a child can walk through and come out the other side of it, not broken, but forged, shaped by the damage into something harder and clearer and more precisely herself than she might have been if the world had been kinder. He thought about Eleanor, about Lily, about the yellow dress with the embroidered hem. He thought that the world was not fair, which he already knew, and that sometimes it gave you back something you hadn't known you were missing, which he had not known until now. "We'll be all right," he said. It was not the kind of thing he said carelessly. Clara looked at him. "I know," she said. What neither of them knew yet was that in Boston, Massachusetts, a woman named Evelyn Whitmore had just received a letter. She had been sitting at her writing desk when it arrived in her tall, narrow house on Beacon Hill, surrounded by the furniture and appointments of a life that had been very carefully and very expensively constructed. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down with the careful precision of a woman who feels a great deal and shows very little. The letter informed her that her niece, her sister Margaret's daughter, the child she had not seen since Margaret married Thomas Whitmore and moved west against all advice, was currently the subject of a custody hearing before the Territorial Board in Denver, Colorado. Evelyn Whitmore had not been aware that Margaret was dead. She had not been aware of any of it. She stood up from the desk. She went to the window and stood looking out at the Beacon Hill street below, at the carriages and the well-dressed pedestrians, and the life she had built with such precision over 40 years, and she felt something shift under it, like ground that had been solid until it wasn't. Then she went to her wardrobe and began to pack. She had a train to catch. Denver was the loudest place Clara had been since Red Hollow. She stood on the boardwalk outside the Territorial Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in January, with her wool coat buttoned to the throat and the fox carving in her coat pocket, and watched the street, the way she watched most things carefully, without showing what she was thinking. Wagons, horses, men in good coats, moving with the particular urgency of people who believe their business was more important than anyone else's. The courthouse itself was a large stone building with a flag on a pole out front that moved in the cold wind with a sound like something being settled once and for all. Silas stood beside her. He'd put on a clean shirt for the occasion. Clara had noticed him pressing it that morning with the flat iron slowly and without comment, and had understood that this was his version of armor. "You ready?" he said. "I've been ready since October," said Clara. He almost smiled. "Come on then." The courtroom was already full when they walked in. 3 men sat behind the judicial bench. The board, Clara understood, 2 territorial representatives and Judge Harker himself, who was older than she'd expected, and had a face that gave nothing away, which she recognized as a skill, and filed away as something to pay attention to. Harlan Pruitt was there. Clara spotted him immediately. He was sitting behind the county representative's table in a good coat with his hat in his hands, and he was smiling, the wide, warm smile she'd heard describe the one designed to make people trust what they liked. He looked at Silas when they entered. His smile didn't change. That told Clara more about him than anything else could have. Marshall Connolly was there. He gave Silas a brief nod. The lawyer, whose name turned out to be Whitfield, was there with a table full of papers and the expression of a man who had spent the last 3 days constructing an argument he was confident in. And in the far left corner of the gallery, sitting straight-backed and very still in a dark traveling coat, with her gloved hands folded in her lap, was a woman Clara had never seen before. Dark hair threaded with silver, fine features. Eyes the exact color and shape of Clara's mother's eyes, which Clara had not seen in 9 months, and which landed in her chest now like a stone dropped into still water. Clara stopped walking. Silas noticed immediately. He looked at her, then in the direction she was looking, then back at her. "You know her?" "No," Clara said. "But I think I know who she is." She walked to her seat. The hearing opened with Whitfield presenting the county's case in the smooth, relentless way of men who do this professionally. He talked about Silas's military record. He talked about the isolation of the mountain cabin. He talked about the absence of female guidance and the importance of civilization for a growing child. He talked about what a young girl deserved, school society, proper influences, and he said it all with the tone of a man who genuinely believed the concern was real. Clara watched Harlan Pruitt while Whitfield talked. Pruitt was watching the judge. His expression was still pleasant, still confident. The expression of a man waiting for a machine he'd set in motion to finish its work. Judge Harker listened to Whitfield without interrupting. Then he looked at Silas. "Mr. Boone, you're representing yourself today." "I am, Your Honor." "Do you wish to respond to the county's presentation?" "I do." Silas stood up. He was the tallest person in the room by several inches, which had a certain effect on the way people listened. "Your Honor, everything Mr. Whitfield said about my living situation is accurate. I live alone. I live in a mountain cabin. I have no wife. I have a military record that includes things I would do differently if I could, and things I would do exactly the same." He paused. What he didn't say is that the complaint driving this hearing was filed by a man who has spent 2 years trying to acquire my land through intermediaries and failed. A man whose brother I removed from my property at Rifle Point last summer while he was conducting an unauthorized geological survey. He looked directly at Pruitt. A man who has silver on his mind and a child's welfare in his mouth, and the two have nothing to do with each other. The room stirred. Pruitt's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Your Honor, these accusations are—" "You'll have a chance to speak, Mr. Pruitt," Judge Harker said without looking at him. He was looking at Silas. "Mr. Boone, the nature of the original complaint is noted and will be part of the record, but the board's concern today is the welfare of the child, not the motivations of the complainant. The question before us is simple. Is Clara Whitmore well cared for in your custody?" "Yes," said Silas. "The board would like to hear from the child directly," Harker said. Clara was already standing. Harker looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not much, not visibly, but she caught it. The slight recalibration that adults made when a child did something they hadn't anticipated. "You'd like to speak," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." "Come forward." She walked to the front of the room and stood before the bench. She had the fox carving in her right hand, not as a prop. Not for comfort, she simply had it the way she kept it with her, now the way some people keep a thing they made because it reminds them they are capable of making things. "Tell me about your life on the mountain," Harker said, not unkindly. "I can read storms," Clara said. "I can split wood. I can track deer and reset snares and identify 14 species of Rocky Mountain birds by call." She paused. "I've read 31 books since August, including a volume on territorial land law that I found on a shelf." She looked at the judge directly. "I sleep through the night. I did not do that before." Harker's expression remained even. "And Mr. Boone's treatment of you, has he ever—" "No," Clara said, before he finished. "You don't know what I was going to ask. Whatever you were going to ask." Clara said, "The answer is no. He has never frightened me. He has never hurt me. He has never once in 5 months made me feel like I was a problem he was sorry he'd taken on." She looked at the board members, then at Whitfield, then at Pruitt. "The people in this room who are concerned about my welfare, I want to ask them something. Where were they in April? Where were they in May, June, July? Where were they in August? When I stood on a platform in the street for 40 minutes in the summer heat without shoes, while 50 people found somewhere else to look." Her voice was clear and steady, and completely without anger, which made it more devastating than anger would have been. I was put on that platform because nobody wanted me. A man they called dangerous and unstable paid $500 and gave me the only real home I've had since my parents died. And now the people who didn't want me have decided they want to decide where I go." She held the judge's gaze. "I respectfully submit, Your Honor, that concern for a child that only appears when that child becomes useful to someone's other interests is not concern at all." The room was silent. Whitfield looked at his papers. Pruitt's smile for the first time had gone slightly wrong at the edges. Harker was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're very well-spoken child." "I had a lot of time to practice," said Clara. "Inside my head, before I started talking again." One of the board members, the younger one on the left, made a sound he covered quickly with a cough. "You may sit down, Clara," Harker said. "Thank you." Clara turned to walk back to her seat, and stopped. The woman in the dark traveling coat had stood up. "Your Honor," she said. Her voice was low and controlled and Eastern-educated, and trembling only slightly at one edge, the edge she couldn't quite manage. "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Evelyn Whitmore. I am Margaret Whitmore's sister. I am Clara's aunt." The room rearranged itself around this information. Clara turned fully to face her. Evelyn Whitmore looked at her niece across the courtroom, at this small, self-possessed child with her oversized wool coat and her carved fox and her mother's jawline and her composure, which had been considerable, did something complicated. "I didn't know," Evelyn said. "About Margaret, about Thomas, about any of it." Her eyes were steady, but there was something working behind them that Clara recognized because she had felt it herself, the particular grief of finding out you missed something that couldn't be unmissed. "I received a letter 3 weeks ago. I took the first train I could." She looked at the judge. "I want to speak if I may." Harker nodded. "Go ahead, Mrs. Whitmore." Evelyn came forward to stand where Clara had just stood. She was elegant in the way of women who have learned to use elegance as a kind of armor, and Clara watched her with the same careful attention she gave to everything new. "I came here," Evelyn said, "prepared to argue for custody of my niece. I have a home in Boston. I have resources. I can provide school, society, everything a girl of her station ought to have." She paused. "I rode the train from Boston to Denver, and I thought about what I was going to say for most of those miles." She looked at Clara. "Then I sat in that gallery and I listened to my niece speak." Another pause. "And I realized that what I prepared to say was a case for giving Clara what I thought she should want, not what I had any evidence she actually needs." Silas at his table had gone very still. "My sister chose Thomas Whitmore over everything our family expected of her," Evelyn said. "She chose him because she loved him, and because she knew her own mind, which was always one of Margaret's most inconvenient qualities." The ghost of something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but close. "Clara is her mother's daughter." She faced the judge. "I am not withdrawing my interest in my niece's life, but I am withdrawing my claim to remove her from the custody of the man who gave her back her voice." She took a breath. "I would ask only that I be permitted to know her, that I be allowed to be part of her life in whatever way she chooses to allow." She looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her. In her coat pocket, her hand found the fox carving. "Your Honor," Pruitt said, rising quickly. "With respect, this woman's sentiment is touching, but it doesn't address the board's legitimate concern regarding Mr. Boone's suitability." "Mr. Pruitt." Harker's voice had developed an edge. "I am going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Did you file this complaint out of concern for the welfare of Clara Whitmore?" Pruitt's smile reasserted itself. "Your Honor, as a member of this community, that is not a direct answer. I have concerns regarding—" "Mr. Pruitt, I have your brother's geological survey in front of me." Harker held up a document. "Filed with the Territorial Land Office in October. It references a silver deposit on a mountain parcel currently occupied by one Silas Boone." He set it down. "This document was subpoenaed 2 days ago at Marshal Connolly's request. I want to be very clear about what I'm looking at." Pruitt went completely still. Connolly in the gallery was studying the far wall with great interest. "Your Honor," Whitfield said, gathering himself, "the survey is entirely separate from the complaint regarding the child." "Is it?" Harker looked at him, then at Pruitt. "In 23 years on this bench, I have heard a great many custody arguments. I have never heard one that was simultaneously a mineral rights case." He looked at his papers. "The complaint is dismissed. On the record, the board finds no grounds to challenge Mr. Boone's custody of Clara Whitmore." He looked at Silas. "The question of a formal legal guardianship arrangement, permanent, not provisional, is something the board is prepared to execute today if Mr. Boone wishes." Silas stood. "I wish." "And the child, Clara, you understand what's being asked?" Clara stood beside Silas. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you are in agreement?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then it will be done." Harker picked up his pen. "We'll have the paperwork completed within the hour." The room began moving again. Voices, chairs, the general rearrangement of people when a decision has been made. Whitfield was gathering his papers with the careful, neutral expression of a professional who had lost but was already thinking about the next case. Pruitt was speaking to someone in the gallery in a low, urgent voice. Connolly was moving toward Silas with his hand extended. Clara was not looking at any of them. She was looking at Evelyn Whitmore, who was standing 10 feet away and making no move to approach. Giving her space, Clara understood which was the right instinct and noted accordingly. Clara walked toward her. Evelyn's composure held. Just. Up close, she was more like Margaret than Clara had expected. Or maybe just the parts of Margaret that Clara had inherited: the jaw, the eyes, the way they both went very still when they were working something out. "You look like her," Evelyn said. "Your mother." "People say that," Clara said. "I haven't seen Margaret in 11 years. Evelyn's voice was even. "We argued when she went west. I said things I didn't mean, and some I did, and I waited too long to write." Her hands, still gloved, were clasped in front of her. "I am sorry for that. I can't fix it. I can only tell you that I am here now." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Do you have pictures?" she said. "Of her? From before?" Evelyn blinked. "Yes, I have photographs, and letters she sent me in the early years before we stopped writing, and some things that belonged to her jewelry, a shawl she left when she visited once." Her voice quieted. "They've been in a box in my house for years. I didn't know what to do with them." "I'd like to have them," Clara said. "If you'd give them to me." "Of course," Evelyn said, immediately without hesitation. "They're yours. They were always yours even before I knew you existed." Clara nodded. She looked down at the fox in her hand, then held it out. Evelyn looked at it. "What is this?" "I made it," Clara said. "You can have it. For coming." She paused. "I know you came to fight for me. Even if I don't need you to fight for me, I know that's why you came. And I think my mother would have wanted me to know you're here." Evelyn took the carving with both hands. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she pressed her lips together and looked up and said with great dignity, and only the smallest tremor, "You are exactly like her. Exactly." Silas was beside Clara. He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at him. Between them passed the particular communication of two people who are on the same side without having planned to be. "Mrs. Whitmore," Silas said. "Mr. Boone." She looked at him the way she had looked at the fox, carefully assigning proper value. "I'm told you paid $500 for her." "I did." "Was she worth it?" Silas looked at Clara. "Every cent," he said. "And then some." Evelyn nodded once, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. "I'll be in Denver through the week," she said. "If Clara would be willing, I'd like to have supper. I have photographs with me. I brought them on the train." She looked at Clara. "If you want." "I want," Clara said. They had supper that evening in the hotel dining room. Silas and Clara and Evelyn Whitmore, who produced from her traveling bag a small leather folder of photographs and letters, and laid them on the table, one by one. Clara looked at each one without rushing, with the precise and serious attention she gave to things that mattered. Her mother at 20 laughing. Her father and mother at their wedding. Her father's hand at the small of Margaret's back, both of them looking at each other instead of the camera. Margaret at 17 with her sister Evelyn in the garden of their Boston house, both of them squinting into the sun. Clara held that last one for a long time. She was stubborn, Evelyn said. Margaret, she had an opinion about everything, and she was right about most of it, which made her very difficult to argue with. She looked at Clara. I'm told you're the same. I'm told that too, Clara said. Silas said nothing. He drank his coffee and watched the two of them with the careful steadiness of a man who understands that some things don't need his involvement, only his presence. Later, walking back through the cold Denver street toward the boarding house where they were staying, Clara was quiet in the way that meant something was working through her. You all right? Silas said. I'm thinking. Okay. Several steps. The cold was sharp, and the sky was clear, and the stars over Denver were not the same stars as over the mountain, too much lamplight blurring their edges, but they were there. She's going to want to visit, Clara said. Evelyn. Probably. Would that be all right, if she came to the mountain? Silas considered it the way he considered most things seriously, without dismissing it and without rushing toward it. She's your family, he said. She's welcome. Clara nodded. 3 more steps. Silas? The judge said permanent guardianship. He did. So it's official. I'm yours, legally. You are. Clara was quiet for another moment. I've been thinking about what to call you, she said. Her voice was careful, precise, the way it got when she was saying something that mattered and wanted to get it right. I haven't called you anything, not directly. I just start talking and you know I mean you. Silas said nothing. He kept walking. But his pace had changed in some small way that was hard to name. I think, Clara said, that I'd like to call you Dad. The word landed in the cold Denver air and stayed there. Silas stopped walking. Clara stopped beside him and looked up at his face. At the scar. At the broken nose. At the winter cloud eyes that she knew better now than she'd known most things in her life, knew what they looked like when he was thinking hard, and when he was holding something in, and when he was about to say something true that cost him something to say. He was doing that last one now. He crouched down the way he had on the auction platform. Eye level. Not grabbing her. Not performing it. Just looking at her with the full, direct, unguarded attention he kept in reserve for things that actually mattered. I would be honored, he said. His voice was not quite steady. If you called me that. Clara nodded, as if it were settled, which it was. She straightened up and started walking. Dad? She said, testing the sound of it. Silas stood up. He cleared his throat. He started walking beside her. Yeah, he said, quietly, as if something that had been closed for a long time had just opened and let light in. They walked back to the boarding house in the cold Denver night. A broken soldier and a rebuilt child moving through a city that didn't know their names and wouldn't have understood their story. And it didn't matter at all. Because the only story that had ever mattered was the one they were still writing. They rode back to the mountain on a Friday. The court papers were folded in Silas's inside coat pocket next to his heart. Not because he was sentimental about it, or so he would have said if asked, but because the inside pocket was the safest place on his person, and the papers were the most important thing he was carrying. Clara sat in front of him on the horse, the same way she had that first August afternoon, except that everything else was different. She sat straighter. She kept her eyes on the trail ahead instead of the ground. And when the first familiar ridge came into view through the trees, she said, "There it is," in a voice that meant home. There it is, Silas agreed. The cabin was exactly as they'd left it. Cold inside, banked fire needing to be rebuilt, the shelves of books. Undisturbed, the hearthrug still holding the impression of where Clara sat when she read. She went around the room touching things with one hand, the shelf, the table edge, the iron latch on her bedroom door, the way you confirm a thing is real after you've been away from it long enough to doubt. Same as we left it, she said, Always is, said Silas. He was already at the fireplace, coaxing the embers. Mountain doesn't change while you're gone. That's one of the things I like about it. Clara stood in the center of the room. She looked at everything once carefully. Then she went to the shelf and pulled out a new book she'd bought 3 in Denver, thin volumes on wood joinery and sculpting technique, and sat down at the table and opened the first one. Silas watched her from the corner of his eye. He said nothing. He finished with the fire and put the coffee on, and the cabin filled with warmth and smell and the particular quality of silence that meant everything was exactly right. That was January of 1874. What came after is the part of the story that doesn't move in a straight line, because real life rarely does. It moved in seasons and accumulations, small things that built on each other the way snowfall builds each inch unremarkable, until you look up and realize the world has been remade. Spring came, and with it, the news that Harlan Pruitt had submitted a second formal complaint to the Territorial Board, this one arguing that the prior hearing had been improperly conducted, and that Silas Boone's custody should be reviewed again. Clara read the notice when it arrived. Connolly sent it by Ryder with a note in his own hand that said simply, "He won't stop," and she set it down on the table and looked at Silas. "How much of the land law book do you remember?" she asked. "Enough," said Silas. "I remember all of it," said Clara. "And I've read 2 more since January." She picked the notice back up and turned it over. "He filed on grounds of procedural error. He's claiming Judge Harker had a conflict of interest because Connolly requested the Geological Survey subpoena, and Connolly was appointed by the same board that—" She stopped, looked at the paper more carefully. "This is wrong." "Which part?" "All of it. The procedural rules for territorial custody hearings in Colorado don't require board neutrality on subpoenas requested by the Marshal's office. That's federal jurisdiction, not territorial." She set the paper down. "He's got a lawyer who's either sloppy or banking on nobody checking." Silas looked at her. She was 9 years old. She was sitting at his kitchen table in the mountains of Colorado, disassembling a legal argument the way she'd disassembled the wood joinery book with focused patience and no particular sense that it was supposed to be difficult. "You want to write the response," he said. "I already know what to say," said Clara. "Do you have paper?" She wrote 4 pages in her careful, even hand. Silas read it. He changed 2 words. They sent it by the same writer back to Connolly, who forwarded it to the board. 3 weeks later, Pruitt's second complaint was dismissed on procedural grounds, the specific procedural grounds Clara had identified cited in the board's letter, almost word for word. Connolly rode up the mountain himself to deliver that news. He handed Silas the letter and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts professional respect and personal amusement. "Your daughter write that response?" "She did." "How old is she?" 9. Connolly shook his head slowly. "Lord Almighty," he said, "that man has no idea what he's dealing with." He was right. Pruitt tried twice more over the following years, once through the church council citing moral concerns, and once through a territorial land commission that he'd gotten himself appointed to. The church council attempt collapsed when Ruth Alcott, now running a school in Red Hollow, submitted a 12-page letter to the council on Clara's behalf. The Land Commission attempt collapsed when Clara, at age 12, attended the commission hearing herself and spent 40 minutes dismantling Pruitt's argument in front of 6 commission members who had not expected to spend their Tuesday being educated by a child. After that, Pruitt stopped trying. He didn't stop hating it. Clara knew that, and she didn't particularly care. A man who needed her gone to get what he wanted had spent 6 years failing to make that happen, and she was not inclined to spend energy on him beyond the minimum required to keep him contained. She had other things to do. The carvings had started as something private, her hands working, while her mind ran the same way some people talk to themselves or pace a floor. She'd finished the fox the day before they left for Denver and given it to Evelyn, and then started another one on the train ride back, a small bear from a piece of pine she'd picked up near the station. She hadn't thought of it as making art. She'd thought of it as thinking with her hands. It was Evelyn who first used the word. She came to the mountain in June of that first year, arriving by horse with a guide from Red Hollow, wearing a riding coat that was slightly too Eastern for the terrain and managing it with dignity. She and Silas had reached an understanding in Denver that functioned better in practice than either of them would have predicted. They were not friends exactly, but they were two people who loved the same child from different angles and had enough sense to find that useful rather than competitive. She walked into the cabin and saw the shelf where Clara kept her carvings, 15 of them by then, lined up in order of completion, and she stopped. "Clara," she said, "these are extraordinary." "They're just things I make," Clara said. "No." Evelyn reached out and picked up the bear, then the fox she hadn't seen since Denver. Clara had made a second one slightly larger, the motion more precise. "This is art. This is serious, skilled, accomplished work." She set them down carefully. "Who taught you?" "Nobody," said Clara. Evelyn looked at Silas. "She taught herself," he said. "Started the first week she was here." Evelyn looked back at the shelf. At the fox, the bear, a running deer, an eagle with its wings half open. A woman's hand reaching upward that Clara had never explained, and nobody had asked about. "These need to be seen," Evelyn said. "They're seen," said Clara. "You're seeing them right now." "By more people than me." Evelyn straightened. "When you're ready. Not before. But they need to be seen." Clara didn't argue. She put it in the part of her mind where she kept things that might become relevant later and went back to the piece she was working on. Evelyn came every summer after that. She brought books, the good kind, not the patronizing kind, because she had learned quickly that underestimating Clara was an error you only made once. She brought photographs and letters and the slow, careful work of two people building something from materials they hadn't chosen, a relationship made from a loss, from 11 years of absence, and a grief that belonged to both of them, because Margaret had belonged to both of them. They talked about Margaret the way you talk about someone when the grief has finished being sharp and become something that can be handled. Evelyn told stories, the stubborn ones, the funny ones, the ones that made Clara laugh and then go quiet in a particular way. Clara listened and kept them and added them to what she already had, which was the laugh and the wagon, and the word her mother had said, once clearly, before the silence. She was building Margaret back from pieces, the way she built her carvings, starting with the shape she could see inside the material and working toward it patiently until it emerged. It helped. In ways she didn't have words for, it helped. She was 13 when the first stranger came. A boy of about 15 walking up the mountain trail alone in November, with a split lip and one eye swollen shut, and nothing on his back but a burlap sack with 2 shirts in it. He stopped at the edge of the yard and didn't come closer the way people stopped when they weren't sure of their welcome, and Clara, who was splitting wood while Silas was out checking the north trap line, set down the axe and looked at him. "You hurt bad," she said. "I've been worse," he said, which was probably true from the look of him. "You hungry?" He looked at the ground. "I ain't asking for charity." "I didn't offer charity," Clara said. "I offered food. Those are different things." She picked up the axe. "Come in if you want. Fire's going." His name was Joseph. He was an orphan out of a town 2 counties south, running from a placement that had turned brutal in ways he described in a flat, careful voice that told you he'd decided to stop expecting anyone to do anything about it. He ate everything on the table and didn't apologize for it. Silas came back from the trap line, took in the situation in one glance and said, "You're welcome to stay the night," in the same tone he'd used on Clara the first evening without drama. Joseph stayed 3 nights, then 3 weeks. Then in the quiet way that things became permanent on that mountain, he simply stayed. He was the first, he was not the last. Over the years that followed, the mountain cabin became something that had no official name, but that people in the territory came to know existed the way people know that certain places have a quality that is harder to explain than to find. A widow from Alamosa with 2 young children and nowhere left to go. A veteran from the war young who had come back from it speaking too little and flinching too much and whose family had run out of patience. An abandoned girl from a mining camp who was 7 years old and had been living on her own for 3 weeks when she walked up the mountain trail with shoes held together by wire. Silas never turned anyone away. Clara never asked him to. They made room the way the mountain made room, not because there was more space than before, but because the definition of enough kept adjusting to fit what was needed. Joseph was 20 by then. Broad-shouldered, steady, still quiet in the particular way of people who had learned that quiet kept them safe and hadn't entirely unlearned it yet. He'd become Silas's right hand on the property, building a second structure off the south side of the cabin, a long, low bunkhouse that could hold 8 people and had a proper stove and a bookshelf of its own. "You're building a town," Clara told Silas one evening, watching him review the bunkhouse plans. "I'm building a house," Silas said. "That's what people say before they build a town. Don't get ahead of yourself." "I'm never ahead of myself," said Clara. "I'm exactly where the situation is." The carvings were known across Colorado by the time Clara was 15. Evelyn had arranged for 3 pieces to be shown at a gallery in Denver on one of her visits, arranged it carefully without telling Clara until it was already done, which was a risk she'd calculated and accepted. Clara had been furious for approximately 1 afternoon. Then the gallery owner wrote to say all 3 pieces had sold within an hour of opening, and that he had received 11 inquiries about additional work. Clara had stood in the yard reading that letter. Silas had come and stood beside her without asking what it said. $12 a piece, she said. "That's good money," he said. $36 total. She folded the letter. "I'm going to put it toward the bunkhouse roof." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." She pocketed the letter. "I want to." She paused. "There's money left over. I thought we could use it to buy shoes for whoever comes next." She looked at him. "Because I remember what it was like to not have any." Silas said nothing for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "We can do that." By the time Clara was 17, people climbed the mountain specifically to buy her work. She was known not just in Colorado, but in territories west and east. A Denver newspaper had published a piece about her the previous winter, with one of her pieces illustrated on the front page, and the letters had come for weeks afterward. She read them all. She answered some. She kept carving. She also kept the mountain. When Harlan Pruitt died in the spring of Clara's 17th year, quietly in his bed in Red Hollow, his fortune diminished by legal fees and bad investments and the particular cost of 6 years of sustained failure. Clara read the notice in the county paper and said nothing. Silas said, "You want to say anything about it?" "No," said Clara. "He spent 6 years trying to take something that wasn't his, and he didn't get it. That's the whole story." She set the paper down. "I'm going to go check on the Alderman children. The youngest one was coughing last night." She walked out. Silas watched her go. At 17, she moved through the world the way the mountain moved through it, solidly, without apology, with a gravity that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with being exactly what she was in exactly the place she was supposed to be. He thought about Eleanor, about Lily, about the yellow dress. He thought about an auction platform on an August morning in 1873, and a small girl with no shoes who hadn't spoken in months and hadn't looked up until he knelt down. He thought that grief was a strange and serious thing, and that it didn't leave. It didn't leave, it just got company. It got crowded out by other things that were also real and also true. And eventually you realized that 2 things could live in the same house without destroying each other. The same way the mountain held winter and spring simultaneously at different altitudes, the same way a person could carry loss and fullness at once without either one being a lie. On the morning of Clara's 18th birthday, Silas rose before dawn. By the time she came out of her room, he was at the table with his coffee and a leather folder in front of him. Clara looked at the folder, then at him. "What is that?" "Sit down," he said. She sat. He slid the folder across the table. She opened it. It was the deed to the mountain, the entire parcel, Upper Ridge, Lower Pasture Creek easement, all of it. Transferred in full to Clara Whitmore. Boone recorded with the Territorial Land Office on the 14th of January, 1884. His name removed, hers in its place. Clara stared at it. She stared at it for a long time. "Silas," she said. "It's yours," he said. "Always was if you think about it from the right angle." "You can't give me the mountain." "I just did. The paperwork's filed, already legal." He picked up his coffee cup. "You're free to do whatever you want with it. Sell it, stay on it, give it away. It's your choice." Clara closed the folder. She laid both hands flat on top of it. She looked across the table at this man, this enormous, war-scarred, broken-hearted, unexpectedly gentle man who had knelt on a platform in August heat and changed both their lives with a leather pouch and 6 words. "Why?" she said. "Because you earned it," he said. "And because I want you to know, I need you to know that you don't stay here because you have to. You never have to stay anywhere because you have to. You stay because you choose to, or you go because you choose to. Either way, it's yours." Clara was quiet for a moment. Joseph came in from outside, stopped when he read the room, and quietly went back outside. He'd been on the mountain long enough to know when a moment wasn't his. "Do you want me to go?" Clara asked. Her voice was even, not afraid of the question, just asking it. "I want you to be free," Silas said. "Those aren't the same thing." Clara looked down at the folder. Then she looked up at her father. The word still lived exactly where she'd put it the first time in the cold Denver street, and it had not shifted an inch in 10 years. "You taught me something," she said. "When I was 8, I didn't understand it then. I think I do now." "What's that?" "The day you came down off this mountain and rode into Red Hollow." She held his gaze. "You didn't have to do that. Nobody made you. Nothing required it. You came because you chose to." She pressed her hands against the deed. "That's what freedom is. Not running from something. Choosing something. Deliberately. Knowing what it costs and choosing it anyway." She looked around the cabin, the shelves, the fire, the hearthrug, the door with the good iron latch, and then back at him. "I choose this. I choose you. I choose this mountain and the people on it and the life we built here that nobody wanted us to have." Her voice was clear and full and did not waver. "I am not here because I have nowhere else to go. I am here because this is exactly where I want to be, and I would choose it again every single day." Silas set down his coffee cup. He pressed his lips together. His eyes, the winter cloud ones, were doing something that he would deny later if anyone brought it up. "All right then," he said. "Coffee's still hot." "Good," said Clara. She stood up. She picked up the deed and walked to the shelf and set it between the bird book and the land law volume where it fit exactly. "I'm going to go check the south fence line. Joseph said there was a post down." "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He stood up, reached for his coat. "I want to." They walked out into the January mountain morning together. A man of 53, who moved a little slower than he once had, and a woman of 18, who moved like someone who knew exactly where she was going and had no doubts about the terrain. Behind them, the cabin held its fire and its books and its 8 sleeping people. The alderman children, the veteran from last autumn, a young woman who'd arrived 6 days ago with nothing but a bruise on her cheek and a fierce, frightened pride that Clara had recognized immediately and handled accordingly. Word had gone out across Colorado, the way word goes out when something true and important exists and people need it. There was a mountain north of Red Hollow where the door was always unlocked, where no one asked about your past before they fed you, where a woman with scarred hands and steady eyes made things of such beauty that grown men stood in front of them and forgot to speak, and where an old mountain man, who had once frightened an entire town, sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the sky with the quiet contentment of a man who has made his peace with the world, not because the world got better, but because he chose to stop fighting what he couldn't change and start building what he could. They were not a legend because they were perfect. They were a legend because they were real, because they had failed and grieved and nearly broken and had chosen each of them to stay, to show up, to keep the fire going one more night and then one more after that, until the fire became the kind of thing people traveled toward instead of away from. On Clara's 18th birthday, standing on the mountain that was now legally hers, watching her father walk the fence line ahead of her, with his coat collar up against the cold. She understood something that she would spend the rest of her life trying to put into words, for the people who came to her, looking for something they couldn't name. A family is not given to you. It is not inherited or assigned or purchased or declared. A family is built slowly, imperfectly, at great personal cost by the people who look at each other across all the reasonable distances and say, "I choose you." Not because it is easy, not because it is safe, but because the alternative is to go through this life without having chosen anything that matters. Silas stopped at the fence line. He turned and looked back at her. "Post isn't down," he called. "Joseph was wrong." "Joseph's been wrong before," Clara called back. "You want to walk the ridge anyway? View's good this morning." Clara looked at the ridge, at the sky above it, which was the particular blue of winter mountain mornings, hard and clear and exactly what it was without apology. "Yeah," she said, "let's walk the ridge." She went to stand beside him. He looked out at the view. She looked out at the view. The world spread itself below them in every direction. The valley, the forests, the thread of the river, the smudge on the southern horizon. That was the town where a man named Finch had once called out numbers that nobody answered. "We did all right," Silas said. "We did better than all right," said Clara. He looked at her sideways. "Don't get ahead of yourself." "I told you," she said. "I'm never ahead of myself." She looked out at the mountain that was hers now, and the sky above it, and the life below it, that she had not been given but had fought for and built and chosen with both hands. "I'm exactly where the situation is." The silent orphan nobody wanted became the woman who took in everyone the world had thrown away. And the mountain that once hid a broken soldier from the world became the place where broken people came to remember that broken was not the same as finished. Some of us are not found in the easy places. Some of us have to be found on a platform in the heat of August by the one person stubborn enough to kneel down and look us in the eye and say, "I see you. And I'm not leaving without you." That is the whole story, and it is enough.